recap on what Dan and Jeff have said about this latest report on the Spanish mackerel. Essentially what you've got is a new report with new data, in inverted commas, supposedly going back to 1911 or 1912. And when you look at that data, you think, how on earth did they dream up this data from 1911 to 1941 when the fish board started, or whatever the date was, because it looks very, very suspicious. And then you've got to wonder, well, how good is the data from 1941 to the 1970s? Well, we didn't really know much about the fishing effort that was going on there. It's got very large error bars, so there's more data of dubious quality that's in there. But most of all, what's ended up happening with this new report is they've got themselves a new model. And the model is just a calculation with a whole lot of parameters that you can change the values of. And they've adjusted those parameters so that suddenly we go from a fishing stock rate of 40% or whatever they claimed a few years ago, and suddenly it's dropped below apparently 20%. Now, one of the most important parameters in that model is this thing called the steepness parameter. We won't go into the detail, but essentially in the peer reviewer of the model reckons that the normal value you'd use for this would be 0.65 or 0.6, but the people who did the stock assessment in the report reckon the value is 0.3 or 0.45 or something. The number doesn't matter too much. But it makes a huge difference on what you then calculate the number of mackerel are out there. It makes a factor of 3 difference. So you go from about 17% to about 60%. Now, in the same assessment, they're saying, well, we might have to close the fishery to bring it back from 17% up to where we want to be, which happens to be about 60%. But all they have to do is change the value on the model, and they're back at 60% anyway. All right. So the normal value that would be used in these models would give you a value of about 60%. In other words, a very healthy mackerel fishery, which is what we seem to be. But by changing that value, we artificially pretend that the value is much lower than it actually is. So there are huge problems here with the way that this report has been done. And in the end, this is fundamentally an issue of the quality assurance of the science that we're supposedly using. Now, let me just ask you guys a question. I wouldn't mind a show of hands. Would you guys accept if this work was done in a properly quality assured way, that you would accept the result of it? Hands up if you would accept if it was done in right. So essentially virtually everybody. And that, of course, that's obvious. But the problem is that we're not getting good quality assured science in this report. Now, I'm just going to broaden this because this is not just a problem with the mackerel fishery. It's not even a problem with the fishery, the whole fishery, or even the Great Barrier Reef. This is a much bigger problem with the quality assurance systems which we're using in a lot of science, especially in the environmental sciences. Now, you've probably not heard of a thing called the replication crisis in science, but you should be, because it turns out that in large areas of science, when they check the work, like we need to have this report checked properly, but when they check the work, they find out that about 50% of the time, the original peer-reviewed work ends up being wrong. This is in the biomedical area, it's in psychology, it's even in physics and chemistry, all right? And the reason is that a lot of the peer-reviewed literature is not actually properly quality assured. Now, in most cases, peer review is a very cursory process. So they'll give the work to a couple of scientists who are often just the mates of the people who've done the original work, and they'll check it for a few hours or a couple of days, and this isn't enough quality assurance. To check that report properly takes weeks of work, and you've got to go over the data, and you've got to check the data. It turned out for this report, the peer review was done very rigorously. The guy took 3 weeks to do it, so we actually had a halfway decent peer review. But it turned out that in this case, the peer reviewer actually said he disagreed with the main conclusion of the report, as Dan said, right? So we've got the report, we've got the peer reviewer who states very explicitly that he disagrees with the stock assessment, and then we have the minister come along just yesterday and say, oh, it's been peer reviewed, but he failed to mention that the peer review disagreed with the actual conclusion of the report. So that's a shocking situation that's happened. I don't know whether the minister's actually ever read the peer review, but he's certainly been misled by somebody if he hasn't and thinks that the peer review supports the original thing. But coming back to peer review, it's often not done very well. If we look at the Great Barrier Reef, which I've got a sort of a bigger interest in, a lot of the stuff which claims damage to the Great Barrier Reef is just appalling science. I won't call it science because it's not science, because it hasn't been done properly. So, for example, I spent, most of a career looking at sediment on the Great Barrier Reef, right? So we invented the instruments for measuring sediment concentrations out on the reefs for long periods of time. We had more measurements than any other people of what the sediment concentrations were. And we were able to demonstrate that the stuff coming from farms wasn't getting out to the reef. Yes, it gets into Trinity Bay, and Trinity Bay blows up and goes muddy every time there's a southeaster, but it's done that since eternity. It's always been like that. But by the time you get out onto the reef, there's minuscule amounts of sediment from farms. So we were able to demonstrate that again and again and again. Other scientists have been able to demonstrate it again and again. But in the major reports on the reef, coming out of Gabrumpa and AIMS and various other organisations, they still claim that somehow this sediment is causing damage to the reef. So there we have a major quality assurance problem that's affecting, in that case, the farmers, right? That's not your problem, but it's the same fundamental problem of poor quality assured science, making stuff up essentially, which then ultimately affects real people, doing real jobs and feeding the population. I could talk more about that. So, for example, pesticides. Supposedly the pesticides coming off farms is damaging the reef. But when you actually go out onto the reef and you take a water bottle sample and then you run that through the most sensitive scientific equipment to try to measure the pesticides levels, they're in such low concentrations that they cannot even be measured. You're talking about concentrations in some cases down to parts per billion, and you can't measure it. And yet farmers are blamed for killing the Great Barrier Reef. Or a crazy one, I just mentioned this, it's very different to the fishing thing, but supposedly coal dust blowing off the coal loading facilities down at Hay Point is damaging the Great Barrier Reef. It turned out that this paper that supposedly said this had a 3,000% error in it, right? Now we've pointed this out to the organisation that produced it. The wrong information has been said to a Senate inquiry. It's reported in all the big reports on the Great Barrier Reef. Just last year it was reported in the quasi-United Nations report on the reef that coal dust was actually damaging the reef. And yet there's a 3,000% error in there, and none of the institutions will do anything about this to remove this dodgy information. They know it is wrong, but they will not remove it because there's no interest for them. So we have unfortunately got to the situation that we've got a lack of quality assurance in the science. We cannot trust the institutions by and large, even though that there's lots of good scientists working in them. But if you're a scientist and you're working in fisheries at the moment and you think there's something wrong with this fisheries report, what's going to happen to you if you put up your hand and say, I think that these fishermen are right, that there's a problem with this science, this quasi-science? What's going to happen to somebody of that nature working in that organisation? They're going to end up being removed pretty damn quickly, or at least their promotion prospects are not going to be looking too good for the next decade or two. So that's the problem we've got. We've ultimately got a quality assurance problem, and that the only way we're going to solve this is to get proper audits done on a whole lot of this science. So I'll ask you for a hands up again, who supports quality assurance of the science and a proper audit of this report? Thanks very much. My case rests, my lord.